Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Just gave my official Super Bowl prediction. I took the Chiefs. So be it. This is the situation we just happen to be in. But we will obviously be touching on a lot of that come Monday. But till then, going to spend the rest of this show talking about some more basketball related topics, specifically altering around the trade deadline that concluded yesterday. I don't know. I think that in a lot of ways it was a little bit underwhelming. There really wasn't a lot of star talent that was made available for trade, and that was sort of something we knew coming into it. But then there were chances that we would see players that have been all-stars or have all-star potential like DeJounte Murray or DeMar DeRozan. One of these guys end up being moved, and the two of them, of course, were not. And all in all, we just got a lot of small moves. It wasn't necessarily that there was a lack of quantity of the moves. It was just the quality of them that was, a little bit lackluster. But nonetheless, we are going to be talking about the winners and losers from this trade deadline. Now, I don't think that there were all too many significant, huge winners, but if there were to be any, I think that the New York Knicks would have to be on that list. I mean, just through the past month and a half, if you had gone back in time and asked me, what would it cost for them to get OG Anunoby, Bojan Bogdanovic, and Alec Burks, I would say a couple of, top young pieces, which to some degree they did have to give up. But to give up no first round picks, I would have not believed you had you told me that was the case. But the Knicks were able to pull it off. I thought that the price that they paid for OG, I mean, that was a little bit polarizing at the time, I feel like, with a lot of people. But I feel like if you had been watching enough Knicks games, there was just that lack of consistency with RJ Barrett, and then the fact that OG Anunoby was coming in, and I know that he is currently dealing with an injury. The update on that is that he should be back and practicing within the next 3 weeks, so that's good news for Knicks fans there. But I think that OG just provides all of sort of the highs of what we were hoping that RJ Barrett could see. Now, I think that RJ has a little bit of even a higher ceiling than OG, specifically offensively. Defensively, I don't know how many better defenders there really are in the NBA than OG, and I feel like that's sort of been overlooked based off of his time in Toronto. And when he really started to come into his own, it was after the 2019 finals, and the Raptors were a little bit of an afterthought. Now he has even take his game to a stronger level then, and playing with the Knicks, I know that he's been dealing with some injuries, but from what we've seen with him, he is somebody who can guard 1 through 5, and I think that he's going to be a game wrecker. It provides a whole nother option, being able to have this guy that, offense isn't really his main focus. It is about being a defensive wrecker. All he really does, and again, I don't mean this in a reductive way, but based off of what's expected from him, especially with Jalen Brunson running the show so much and all of the touches that Julius Randle gets as well, kind of just stands in the corner and knocks down shots. He's very good at what he does on offense. He's not, the shot creation necessarily, and ball handling never really developed like some might thought it would, but he's good at what he does, and he's phenomenal at what he does on the defensive side of the ball. So, we've already talked about this OG Anunoby deal before, but then to add Bojan Bogdanovic and Alec Burks, where Bogdanovic is another guy I was talking about this week, saying I think that he can really help a contending team, I should say. He's extremely efficient on all three levels, in the paint, in mid-range, behind the three-point line. He, has a lot of experience, and I don't mean that in just the way that he's old, but he's been on some of these sort of middling teams that he hasn't been with a true contender, but he was a legitimate number one guy on the Indiana Pacers a handful of years ago when they made it to the playoffs with Victor Oladipo and them, and when they went and they played the Celtics in the first round. Now, they got ran over a little bit in that series, but he's been there. He's been through the lows of the NBA where, it seems like he is ready to take on a bigger stage. And I have no doubts that he would, be able to fit in with a team and not be scared of the moment. Now, it's interesting to see the way whether or not Thibodeau is going to be playing him down the stretch. The Knicks have a very interesting, in a good way, it's a good problem to have, but with their roster construction, it's going to be Jalen Brunson. It's going to be OG Anunoby. It's going to be Julius Randle in a center. Now, Bogdanovic, he adds a lot of size if you want to strictly go that route, but he hasn't always been the best defender, but he can get you a shot pretty much anytime you want. And especially, I think he's an even better regular season guy just for the fact that anytime Julius Randle or Jalen Brunson miss time, they're a little lackluster in terms of other shot creators. So I think that all in all here, Bogdanovic, I'm spending a lot of times on the Knicks here, but I think I really loved what they did at the trade deadline. They didn't give up all too much. Gave away Quickly and Barrett, where, Barrett especially, if you tell me that he's going to reach his full potential and he's going to be an all-star player, that's great. I think that they're a little bit more on the win now. It's not panic mode win now, but they made moves to win now, and I think that they got better from day one, and it's not an all-in scenario. I think that this is a move that should set them a lot better going forward. The other team that I have as a real solidified winner is the Charlotte Hornets. They did what a couple other teams in the league this year did not do, and that was take a look at the reality at hand. You are not a good team. The Hornets are, even worse of an example of not a good team, not even mediocre, but they accepted what they were, and they parted ways with some assets. We saw them trade Terry Rozier a few weeks ago. They now trade PJ Washington and Gordon Hayward. These are people that, good players, I think all three of them really, but they weren't going to be a part of any sort of contending core, maybe PJ Washington, but even still, I think that the Hornets are a long way away, and you end up getting a couple of first-round picks. You help yourself sink further into the lottery. I just feel like it was the rational, smart decision to go, and now they just had to waive their former lottery pick, James Bouknight, so, there's still a lot of moves away, but I do think that picking this direction, I think direction is the key word in that when we get into some of our losers. I think that's a win in its own. You end up getting a pretty decent return. You get Grant Williams, who is from North Carolina, so a little bit of a hometown guy, has played contributing minutes before for a contending team, and he's still on the younger side. Maybe they can get some things right with him because he was staggering a bit in Dallas. And speaking of Dallas, I think that when you look at this PJ Washington deal, it was a little bit of a win-win. Now, I only had the Mavs as a slight winner because I think that, what we were talking about this week was they should be going in because they decided to go in last year. And you traded for Kyrie Irving, and because of that, you sort of sped up this clock on, are you going to be a contender? They went the direction of yes, and now they're in a position where you trade everything that you did. You've moved these picks in the past. Is it just going to be for having some middling play-in teams for the rest of Luka's stay until he wants out? So they go out, they add PJ Washington, who, like I mentioned, I think that he's in a lot of ways a similar player to Grant Williams. Now, the efficiency with him offensively has sort of dipped year by year, which isn't a great sign. But I think that he can be a good player. Again, Grant, supposedly there was some stuff that came out that he wasn't really getting along. He was rubbing some guys the wrong way in the locker room. So because of that, it sort of just made sense for them to part ways. And, even in that, they gave a pick swap to the Spurs to get Grant Williams. And now they let go of some other picks to get him and Daniel Gafford, who I actually love the addition of Daniel Gafford to this Mavs team. I think that Gafford is, just a very solid player. He's a good screener, a rim runner. He's going to be a great lob threat, I think, for Luka. Him and Derek Lively, I think, share a good amount of traits in terms of the athleticism and the rim running ability. And he's a good enough paint protector. Now, we'll see what PJ Washington can do on the perimeter, because what I was talking about is I really like the Mavs offense. It's just a matter of whether or not they're going to be able to put together any sort of a defensive identity that they can actually, they don't have to just lean on their offense for 4 rounds straight, because at some point it's going to dry out. You're going to run into a team or two that slows you down, and there are some good defenses ahead of them in the Western Conference right now. So again, I have concerns about their long term here, and they unload a couple extra picks to put this team together. They are undoubtedly a better team today than they were yesterday when they made these deals. And it seemed like Mark Cuban and this front office were already sort of telling us that they were all in trying to be a contender as soon as possible. But, they better hope that this plays out in the right way, and not just in terms of are you going to get a championship, but can you be competitive for not just this year, but, stay in the realm at least for the next few years, and specifically prove to Luka that it is worth staying here. Because should Luka leave in a couple seasons, this Dallas Mavericks team is in big trouble because of all the draft capital that they've given up. They don't have control of their own draft pick in like 4 straight years or something like that later this decade. So things could get really ugly for them. You have to get Luka to stay. And as long as you have Luka, I think you can remain in the realm of at least a play-in team. And it stinks to not have your own first round pick, but don't let that completely burn you. Running through some quick losers here to close out. The main 2 that I look at here are some teams that didn't do anything. And I'm not talking about the teams you probably think I'm going to. My biggest loser is the Chicago Bulls. I would say I can't believe it, but based off of the track record of this franchise, I sort of can believe that they didn't make any moves. This is now, no player trades have been made for them. Trades including a player, in case you needed the little bit of a spoon-fed explanation there for what I mean. They have not made a trade including a player since 2021. This past draft, they traded a couple second-round picks to move up in the second round and draft Julian Phillips. Been a fine contributing player for them, but ever since putting together this roster a couple years ago when they were among the top seeds going into the All-Star break, a few seasons ago when they traded for Vucevic, they had brought in Lonzo Ball and Alex Caruso, and this team was, really firing. But as it's been pointed out too, this was a team, despite their very good record, were just 2-13 against teams that were over 500. So weren't even, fully considered to be real contenders. And it's only gotten worse from here, and they just continue to stick with this core. I think that I feel really bad for Bulls fans. I think this is a huge disservice to them. And to not move DeRozan, which, DeRozan's a very good player, has been definitely a potential Hall of Fame player when it's all said and done, but he just eats a lot of possessions for them. And you know what? He helped lead them to the comeback a handful of nights ago against the Timberwolves. and they're not a bad team right now, but just go get something for him, because now they're in one of two positions where they're either going to lose him for nothing, or they're going to have to overpay him and likely be paying him until he's 36, 37, 38 years old. And I don't think that that's much better of an option either. So they stick with him. Alex Caruso is someone that, selfishly and unselfishly here, I wanted to see him go play for a contributor, because I think he plays contending level basketball, specifically on the defensive side now, but the way that he's also been able to elevate his shot making. He's shooting somewhere around 40% from three now as well too. So he's become a real guy contributing on the offensive end as well, which you love to see. He's at 39.8% specifically from three this season. So he's been very good, and I didn't want to see him go to one of these other Eastern Conference contenders. So to some degree, I'm like, well, at least he's not there, because I am a Celtics fan, and I didn't want to see that for, very selfish purposes. But Alex Caruso, again, I just think he's too good of a player to sort of be wasted away here. And I think that the Bulls just need to do some internal evaluation with the Kobe Whites and with the Julian Phillips, the Patrick Williams, and the latter two names. The reality is the ceiling probably isn't that high, but again, it's this lack of direction that I've been talking about, and being in that mediocrity area is the worst place you can be in the NBA, and that's where the Bulls have been living for years. The other slight loser I will be giving out before we head to break here is the Atlanta Hawks. Specifically, this revolves around DeJounte Murray. Bogdan Bogdanovic was also an interesting trade piece that, could have been moved, and they probably could have gotten some value for him, but they just decide to stay put, and it just makes things very interesting going forward. When we were on the live show yesterday and the news came out that DeJounte Murray would be staying put, I sort of started spitballing some ideas of, well, what does this mean for Trae Young and the Hawks going forward? Because Murray is an expiring contract. If you think that you're not getting anything for him, or at least not enough, let me say this, if you have no plans to re-sign him, because as we've already seen, him and Trae Young don't really work out together, and I'm not saying it never can, and it's impossible that it does, but DeJounte is a much less effective basketball player when Trae Young is on the court than when he is not. That is, even in this Hawks stint, it's not a pretty fit with them, really. And so you would think that if your plan is to go forward with Trae from here on out, you move DeJounte Murray, you get whatever you can for him, and you sort of begin the retooling almost this offseason. If you end up keeping him now, especially for everything that you gave up for him in the trade a couple of years ago, what does that mean as far as what Trae's future is? Because I don't think that you can just let him walk now. Again, after the package that you gave up for him a couple years ago, you're just going to sit there and be okay with the idea of losing him. You traded 3 first-round picks and a swap for him just a year and a half ago-ish. And now we're looking at this with, what are they going to do going forward here? I think that there's a real chance. Trae Young was reported to be untouchable for the Hawks during this trade deadline. I'm just curious whether or not we could see a change in that. I think that I talked about, again, in the heat of the moment yesterday, I talked about the idea of him going to the San Antonio Spurs. I'm sure they would potentially offer up a lot to him. As I've sort of thought it over since, I think that the Orlando Magic could also be a very interesting potential guy to throw in there. Now, the Magic have a little bit more of a win now mantra, and they didn't make any moves this deadline, but there is a chance I could see them next year trying to make the push. You obviously don't want to sort of stunt the development of these two amazing players that you have in Paolo Banchero and Franz Wagner. You have a ton of guards that could have some ceiling, but I think that, I don't know, it would be a pretty interesting matchup there, I think, if Trae was traded to the Magic. And again, I'm not saying he's going to be traded. I'm not saying they have even expressed any interest in it. In fact, they've done the opposite. But I think that it becomes an interesting conversation going forward. So on that note, we are going to be taking another break. When we come back on the other side, we're going to be talking about the two premier teams really in the eyes of the media that decided to stay put and whether or not they were right or wrong for doing so. So stick with us.